Have you ever received a threat so ridiculous you actually had to read it twice just to make sure you weren't having a stroke? Yeah, me too. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Boise, Idaho, the kind of dry, baking summer Tuesday where the air feels like it's being pushed out of a hairdryer on the maximum heat setting. I had just pulled into my driveway, the tires of my truck crunching against the baked concrete, when I saw it. It was flapping in the hot breeze, taped aggressively to the glass of my front door. A piece of neon orange paper. It practically screamed at me from 30 feet away. I didn't even have to walk up to the porch to know what it was. It was a violation notice from the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. I cut the engine. I let my head rest against the steering wheel for exactly 5 seconds. I exhaled a breath that was mostly exhaustion and a tiny bit of homicidal rage. I stepped out of the truck, and there he was. Richard. Richard was the president of the Whispering Pines HOA. He was a man who wore khaki shorts with a braided leather belt, polo shirts tucked in so tight you could see the outline of his ribs, and a pair of reflective sunglasses that made him look like a knockoff state trooper. He was currently standing on the edge of my sidewalk. He wasn't just standing there, though. No, that would be too normal. Richard was holding a standard, wooden 12-inch ruler. He had the ruler shoved down into the blades of my front lawn. I slammed my truck door. The sound echoed in the quiet, manicured cul-de-sac. "Richard!" I called out, wiping a bead of sweat off my forehead. "What exactly are we doing here? Are we doing elementary school geometry, or are you just measuring the Earth's rotation?" Richard didn't flinch. He slowly pulled the wooden ruler out of the grass. He held it up to the sunlight as if he were inspecting a diamond for flaws. He pursed his lips. 3.2 inches, Richard said. His voice was nasal, sharp, and dripping with an authority he absolutely did not possess in any other aspect of his life. I stared at him. 3.2 what? Your grass, Richard said, tapping the ruler against his clipboard. It is 3.2 inches tall. I measured 3 different quadrants to be sure. The northwest corner near the mailbox is actually pushing 3.3. You are in direct violation of the Whispering Pines Aesthetic Covenant, Section 4, Paragraph B. I walked slowly across my driveway. I looked down at my grass. It looked green. It looked fine. It looked like grass. "Richard, it's 100 degrees outside. Are you seriously out here with a ruler?" "Rules are rules," he said, clicking his pen with his thumb. Click, clack. The legal limit in the Whispering Pines community is exactly 3.0 inches, not 3.1, not 3.2, 3. You are out of compliance. "It's a fraction of an inch," I said, trying to keep my voice completely level. "A stiff breeze would push it under 3 inches. A heavy dew would weigh it down into compliance. You're harassing me over a rounding error." Richard adjusted his reflective sunglasses. He pointed his pen at the neon orange paper taped to my door. "I'm not harassing you. I am enforcing the standards that keep our property values from plummeting into the gutter. That notice is official. You have a 24-hour window to rectify the violation. You need to mow this down to 2 inches immediately." 24 hours? I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was the laugh of a man who was rapidly approaching his breaking point. "I work all day tomorrow. When exactly am I supposed to mow this? At midnight? You'll write me a noise violation ticket before I can even pull the cord on the mower." "That sounds like a personal scheduling conflict," Richard said smoothly. He was enjoying this. He lived for this. If the lot is not brought into full compliance by 5 p.m. tomorrow, the HOA will exercise its right to remedy the situation. "Remedy the situation?" I echoed. "Yes," Richard said, a smug little smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We will dispatch our preferred landscaping company to mow the property, and as per the bylaws, you will be billed for the emergency service. The standard rate is $1,500, plus a $500 fine for the initial violation. So, $2,000, total. Your choice." $2,000. for grass that was 2/10 of an inch too tall. "You're out of your mind," I said. "I am in complete compliance with the bylaws," Richard countered, turning on his heel. 5 p.m. tomorrow. Don't be late." He marched down the sidewalk, his khaki shorts swishing with every step, his clipboard held tight against his chest like a shield. I stood in my driveway, the dry Boise heat radiating off the concrete, feeling a vein pulsing in my temple. I walked up to my front door. I ripped the orange paper off the glass. It was exactly as he said. A 24-hour notice. $500 fine? $1,500 emergency landscaping fee. I walked inside. The air conditioning hit me like a wall of ice. I walked straight through the kitchen, straight through the living room, and out the back door to the garage. I grabbed the handle of my trusty red push mower. I dragged it into the center of the garage. I checked the gas. Full. I checked the oil. Fine. I primed the engine, I grabbed the pull cord, braced my foot against the deck, and ripped it back with everything I had. Clank, sputter, wheeze. Nothing. I pulled it again. Harder this time. Clank. A horrible metallic grinding sound echoed off the drywall. A small puff of black smoke drifted up from the engine block. I let go of the cord. I stared at the mower. It was dead. Completely, utterly, unequivocally dead. The piston had seized. The engine was a solid block of useless metal. Panic started to bubble up in my chest. I pulled out my phone. I searched for small engine repair in Boise. I called the first number. "Bob's Mowers," a gruff voice answered. "Hey, Bob, my mower just seized up. I need it fixed, like today or tomorrow morning." Bob laughed. A deep, hacking smoker's laugh. "Buddy, it's mid-July. I'm backed up for 3 weeks. I can look at it in August." Click. I called the next number. Booked. The next number. Waiting on parts. The next number didn't even answer, just an automated voicemail saying they weren't taking new clients. Okay. Pivot. I searched for landscaping companies. I dialed a highly rated local service. A very cheerful receptionist answered. "Hi, I need someone to come mow my lawn. Just a standard suburban lot. But I need it done tomorrow before 5 p.m. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she chirped. "Our crews are entirely booked out for the next 10 days. Summer rush, you know how it is." I called 5 more companies. Every single one gave me the exact same story. Nobody does emergency same-day mowing in the middle of the summer rush. Nobody. I sat down on a plastic cooler in my garage. I looked at my dead mower. I looked at the orange slip of paper in my hand. Richard knew this. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew nobody could get a landscaper on 24 hours' notice in the middle of July. He knew my only option would be to take the hit, let the HOA send their overpriced preferred guys, and slap me with a $2,000 bill. It was a trap. A perfectly legal, thoroughly documented, airtight trap set by a man with too much free time and a microscopic amount of power. Submit? Pay $2,000 for 2/10 of an inch of grass? Absolutely not. I walked back inside the house. The sun was going down. The shadows in the living room were stretching out long and dark. I made a pot of coffee. A whole pot. It was 8 o'clock at night. I poured a mug so black it seemed to absorb the light around it. I walked into my home office, sat down at my desk, and cracked my knuckles. If Richard wanted to play the legal game, we were going to play the legal game. I opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room. First, I pulled up the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. A 74-page PDF of pure, distilled suburban misery. I used the search function. I jumped straight to Section 4, Paragraph B. All residential lawns must be maintained at a uniform height not to exceed 3.0 inches. Failure to maintain acceptable landscaping standards will result in a 24-hour notice of violation. If the homeowner fails to remedy the violation within the allotted time frame, the association reserves the right to contract a third-party landscaping service to bring the property into compliance, the cost of which, along with applicable fines, shall be assessed directly to the homeowner. It was bulletproof. Richard had the bylaws on his side. But bylaws are just contracts. They aren't the law of the land. They exist at the very bottom of the legal food chain. They are subservient to municipal codes. Municipal codes are subservient to state laws. State laws are subservient to federal laws. I needed a bigger hammer. I started digging into the city of Boise municipal codes. I scrolled through zoning regulations, noise ordinances, and property line disputes. Nothing. Nothing that would get me out of mowing my lawn. The clock ticked over to midnight. The coffee was making my heart race, but my brain felt sharp, laser-focused. I looked at the pictures I had taken of my backyard earlier that week for a family group chat. The grass back there was even worse than the front. But it wasn't just grass. It was hot, dry, crispy. Mixed in with the Kentucky bluegrass were these nasty, spiky weeds. Cheatgrass. The bane of the American West. Highly flammable, invasive cheatgrass. Flammable. I opened a new tab. I searched for City of Boise Fire Code. I scrolled past the regulations for commercial sprinkler systems and fire hydrant placements. I kept scrolling until I hit a specific appendix. The Wildland Urban Interface Code. The WEUI. Boise sits right on the edge of the high desert foothills. Wildfires are a massive threat. The city takes fire mitigation extremely seriously. I leaned closer to the screen. My eyes scanned the text. Property owners within designated WUI zones are required to maintain defensible space by mitigating dry brush, dead vegetation, and highly flammable noxious weeds, including but not limited to Bromus tectorum, cheatgrass. Okay, I had a duty to clear the weeds. But how? I still didn't have a mower. I kept reading the mitigation guidelines. Approved methods of fuel reduction and hazard abatement include mechanical clearing, prescribed chemical application, and targeted biological control. Targeted biological control? What the hell is targeted biological control? I highlighted the term. I right-clicked. I hit search. The search engine spat back a list of results. The top result was a link to the Idaho State Department of Agriculture. I clicked it. It loaded a page detailing Idaho Code Paragraph 22 to 2407, landowner duties for noxious weeds. I read the statute. I read it again. My jaw slowly dropped. A massive, wicked smile spread across my face in the dark, empty office. The state of Idaho explicitly authorizes and encourages the use of livestock, specifically goats and sheep, for targeted grazing as a recognized, legally protected biological control method for fire hazard abatement and noxious weed eradication. I switched back to the HOA bylaws. I searched for animals. Section 8, Paragraph A. No livestock, poultry, or farm animals may be kept, bred, or maintained on any lot. It was a direct contradiction. The HOA banned livestock. The state of Idaho explicitly authorized them for environmental protection. Who wins? I pulled up a state Supreme Court precedent database. I typed in a few keywords. Boom. There it was. Well-established legal doctrine. When a private restrictive covenant, like an HOA bylaw, directly conflicts with a state-mandated environmental or safety protocol, like fire hazard mitigation via state-approved biological control, the state law absolutely and unequivocally supersedes the private covenant. The HOA cannot legally enforce a rule that prevents a homeowner from complying with state fire safety codes. It was 2:30 in the morning. My heart was pounding against my ribs. I didn't just have a loophole. I had a tactical nuke. Richard wanted the grass gone. He wanted to use the rules to back me into a corner. He wanted me to submit. But Richard didn't read state agricultural law. I opened a new tab. I didn't search for landscapers this time. I searched for something else entirely. Goat rental, Boise, Idaho. The first result popped up instantly. A company called Chew on This Grazing. Their website looked like it had been built in 2004. It was perfect. They advertised rapid response targeted grazing for weed control and fire mitigation. They serviced the greater Boise area. I looked at the clock. It was too late to call. I sent an urgent contact form through their website, outlining the square footage of my lot and the presence of highly flammable cheatgrass. I shut my laptop. I walked into the kitchen and poured the rest of the cold coffee down the sink. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. I was going to comply with Richard's 24-hour notice. I was going to comply so hard it was going to echo through the annals of Whispering Pines history. Did I know anything about goats? No. Was I going to let Richard win? Absolutely not. I honestly didn't sleep a single wink that night. I mean, I just lay there in bed staring at the ceiling fan, my brain buzzing like a busted neon sign. The clock on my nightstand ticked over to 6:55 a.m. I was already sitting at my kitchen island, phone in hand, thumb hovering over the call button. I had the Chew on This grazing contact page pulled up on my phone, glaring at it like it was a winning lottery ticket. The second the clock hit 7 p.m., I hit dial. It rang exactly one time before a voice answered. It wasn't a corporate greeting. It was just a gruff, gravelly noise that sounded like a tractor engine turning over. Chew on This. Chuck speakin'. Hey, Chuck, I said, leaning over the counter, trying to keep my voice steady. My name is Gaser. I sent an urgent email through your site last night. I, really need a biological weed abatement deployment. Today. As soon as humanly possible. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I heard the unmistakable sound of someone spitting into a tin can. Son, Chuck rasped. I run a livestock operation, not a pizza delivery service. What's the emergency? You got a wildfire creeping up your back fence? Worse, I said, entirely deadpan. I have a homeowners association. Another pause. Then, a low, rumbling chuckle started on the other end of the line. It grew into a full-blown, wheezing laugh. HOA, huh? Chuck said, his voice suddenly warming up. Let me guess. They measuring your grass with a ruler? Literally, yes, I said. 3.2 inches. The limit is 3. They slapped me with a 24-hour notice, and if it's not down to 2 inches by 5 o'clock today, they're sending in their own guys and billing me $2,000. And my mower blew up yesterday. Every landscaper in town is booked. Ain't that just the way? Chuck muttered. HOA boards. Just a bunch of busybodies with clipboards and not enough real problems to solve. You said you got cheatgrass on the property? Tons of it, I confirmed. Backyard is full of it. Front yard has it creeping in. It's a massive fire hazard, honestly. I was reviewing the city WI codes and state agricultural statutes. You don't gotta quote Idaho Code 22247 to me, boy, Chuck interrupted, sounding genuinely impressed. I know the law. I make my living off that specific piece of legislation. You're in a WI zone, and you got noxious weeds. State law says you gotta mitigate, and state law says my goats are a recognized mitigation tactic. That HOA paper ain't worth the ink they used to print it. Exactly, I said, a massive grin spreading across my face. So can you do it? Can you get a crew out here today? I heard Chuck shuffling some papers around. I got a strike team of boar goats just finishing up a BLM contract out near the foothills. They're hungry, they're mean, and they eat cheatgrass like it's cotton candy. 40 head. 40? I blinked. Chuck, I have a standard quarter-acre suburban lot. Is 40 goats going to be, too many? Chuck laughed again. You want 40 head in a suburban backyard? Son, they'll strip it to the dirt in 6 hours. They'll eat the weeds, the grass, the low-hanging branches, and if you leave your lawn chairs out, they might chew on those too. Chuck, my man, I said, staring at the neon orange notice sitting on my kitchen counter. That is exactly what I am paying you for. I want this yard looking like the surface of the moon by 5 p.m. What's the quote? For an emergency, same-day deployment with full temporary fencing setup, $800, cash or card. Done, I said instantly. I'm in the Whispering Pines subdivision. When can you be here? We'll drop the trailer at noon, Chuck said. Have your driveway clear. And buddy, you might want to pull up a chair. This is going to be a hell of a show. I hung up the phone and literally did a fist pump in my empty kitchen. $800 was a lot of money, sure, but compared to the $2,000 the HOA was going to extort from me, It was a bargain. And the emotional payoff? Priceless. I spent the next few hours prepping the yard. I moved the patio furniture into the garage. I unhooked the garden hoses. I basically cleared the deck for the hooved invasion. Every time I walked out to the front yard, I could feel eyes on me. Whispering. Pines was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew exactly what time you took your trash cans out. I saw Mrs. Higgins across the street, peering through her Venetian blinds, her silhouette completely frozen. I just waved at her cheerfully. She snapped the blinds shut. At 11:45 a.m., I was sitting on my front porch with a tall glass of iced tea, just waiting. The neighborhood was dead quiet. The midday heat was settling in, baking the asphalt. Then I felt it before I heard it. A low, rhythmic vibration in the pavement. A massive, beat-up, dual-axle Ford F-350 turned onto the cul-de-sac. It was hauling a battered 30-foot aluminum livestock trailer. The truck was covered in a thick layer of agricultural dust that clearly hadn't been washed off since the Bush administration. The diesel engine roared, echoing off the pristine stucco facades of the surrounding houses. It was the loudest, ugliest, most glorious thing I had ever seen. The truck backed aggressively into my driveway, the trailer tires riding up onto the curb for a second before settling. The engine cut off, and the silence that followed was immediately broken by a chorus of chaotic, impatient bleating. Bah! Ma! Doors opened. Two guys stepped out. The driver was Chuck. He looked exactly like his voice sounded. He was a guy entirely constructed out of leather and beef jerky. He wore a faded Carhartt ball cap, a plaid shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and boots that had seen more mud than most people see in a lifetime. He spat a dark stream of tobacco juice onto my pristine concrete driveway and walked over. His partner was a kid who looked about 19, wearing a high-vis yellow vest and carrying a massive spool of white wire. "You gasser?" Chuck asked, sticking out a hand that felt like a bundle of rebar. "That's me," I said, shaking it. "You made good time." "Goats don't like waiting," Chuck said, looking around the cul-de-sac. He took a deep breath through his nose. "Smells like chlorine, fertilizer, and repressed anger up here. You sure you want to do this?" "Never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. "All right then," Chuck said, turning to the kid. "Bobby, let's get the perimeter secured. Give me the T-posts." Bobby nodded and started dragging heavy metal stakes out of the bed of the truck. Chuck walked the property line with me. He was a professional. He pointed out the cheat grass, identified a patch of invasive thistle I didn't even know I had, and muttered approvingly about the height of my back fence. "All right, the perimeter is solid back here, but we gotta run the hot wire across the front to keep 'em contained," Chuck explained, pointing to the front lawn. "We use an electrified polywire. It ain't gonna kill nobody, but it packs enough of a wallop to keep a goat from wandering off to eat your neighbor's prize-winning petunias." "Electric fence, in the front yard," I repeated, letting the words roll around in my mouth. Honestly, that is music to my ears. Chuck grabbed a sledgehammer from the truck. He walked over to the edge of my lawn, right where my property met the sidewalk. He lined up a heavy metal T-post. Clang. 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 The sound of metal slamming into metal rang out like a gunshot in the quiet neighborhood. I watched, absolutely mesmerized, as Chuck drove a heavy steel agricultural post directly into my perfectly manicured 3.2-inch grass. He drove another one in at the corner, and another one near the driveway. Bobby followed behind him, unrolling the white electric wire and snapping it into the plastic insulators on the posts. They were turning my suburban front yard into a medium-security agricultural holding pen. It took exactly 12 minutes for the HOA to notice. I was leaning against the tailgate of Chuck's truck, chatting with him about the current price of alfalfa, when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Marching down the sidewalk was Gary. Gary was Richard's right-hand man. He was the vice chair of the architectural committee. Gary was the kind of guy who wore socks with his sandals and carried a measuring tape on his belt clip, just in case he needed to verify the dimensions of a neighbor's new mailbox. He was practically vibrating with indignation as he power-walked toward us. "Excuse me! Excuse me!" Gary barked, waving his arms as he approached the edge of the newly installed electric wire. Chuck didn't even look up. He was busy hooking a small black car battery up to the fence line to give it juice. "Can I help you, Gary?" I asked, taking a casual sip of my iced tea. Gary ignored me completely. He locked eyes with Chuck. "Hey! You! Construction worker! What in the name of God do you think you're doing? You cannot put up an unauthorized fence in Whispering Pines. This is a severe violation of the architectural guidelines. Take it down immediately." Chuck slowly finished tightening the clamp on the battery terminal. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He walked over to the fence line, stopping just inches from Gary. Chuck towered over him. "You talking to me, sport?" Chuck asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I am speaking to you, yes," Gary said, though he instinctively took half a step backward. "You are erecting an unapproved structure. Who are you with? What company is this? I need to see your work order." Bobby, the 19-year-old kid, paused his work. He looked at Chuck, then looked at Gary, grinning widely. Chuck reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out his tin of Copenhagen, and packed a lip. He took his sweet time. Gary's face was turning a fascinating shade of plum. "Listen here, pal," Chuck finally said, leaning slightly over the wire. "This ain't a fence. This is a temporary electrified containment perimeter for a state-mandated biological environmental project." Gary blinked. "A what?" "State environmental work, pal," Chuck said, pointing a calloused finger at Gary's chest. "We are executing an emergency fire hazard mitigation protocol authorized under Idaho code. Now, unless you're carrying a badge from the Department of Agriculture, I suggest you step back. That wire is hot, and I really don't want to fill out the paperwork if you fry your pacemaker." Gary looked at the thin white wire. He looked back at Chuck. Then he looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of fury and sheer confusion. "Gay, sir," Gary hissed, his voice trembling. "What is he talking about? What environmental project? You have a 24-hour notice to mow your lawn. Richard told me." "I am mowing it, Gary," I said, gesturing broadly to the yard. "I'm just utilizing a highly specialized, state-approved, eco-friendly method. I'm going green, Gary. You should be thanking me. I'm saving the neighborhood from wildfire." Gary stared at the massive aluminum trailer. The bleating inside had grown louder. It sounded like a heavy metal concert performed entirely by angry sheep. "What is in that trailer?" Gary demanded, pointing a trembling finger. Are those dogs? What is making that noise?" "Those," Chuck said, walking to the back of the trailer and unlatching the heavy metal deadbolt, "are the landscapers." Chuck threw open the double doors of the trailer. The smell hit first. It was a potent mix of hay, manure, and raw, unfiltered farm animal. Gary audibly gagged and covered his nose with his shirt collar. Then, the avalanche began. 40 boar goats spilled out of the back of the trailer like a furry waterfall. They were massive, muscular animals with floppy ears, curved horns, and absolutely zero respect for suburban tranquility. They hit the driveway with a clatter of hooves that sounded like a hailstorm. For a split second, they just stood there, blinking in the bright Boise sunlight, their rectangular pupils scanning the environment. Then, the lead goat, a massive beast with a coat like spilled coffee, locked eyes with my front lawn. He let out a loud, guttural baa! It was a battle cry. The herd surged forward. They poured off the concrete and onto the grass. It wasn't like watching animals graze. It was like watching a swarm of locusts. They descended on the 3.2-inch Kentucky bluegrass with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. Crunch, rip, tear. The sound of 40 goats simultaneously chewing was deafening. It sounded like a massive piece of Velcro being ripped apart. Gary screamed. An actual high-pitched scream. "Livestock!" Gary shrieked, jumping back from the fence. "You have livestock! That is a Category 1 violation! You can't have livestock!" "They ain't livestock today, Gary," I yelled over the sound of the chewing. I walked over to the nearest goat. I had spent 20 minutes earlier that morning with some construction paper, tape, and a Sharpie. I slapped a makeshift paper vest onto the goat's side. In bold black letters, it read, "State Biotechnician." "See?" I pointed at the goat, who was currently eating a dandelion with extreme prejudice. "Highly trained biological weed abatement technicians. It says so right on the uniform." Gary looked like he was going to pass out. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically between me, Chuck, and the sea of goats currently systematically disassembling my landscaping. "I'm calling Richard," Gary yelled, fumbling his phone out of his pocket. He was shaking so badly he dropped it on the grass. He snatched it up, frantically dialing. "I'm calling Richard right now. He's going to call the police. You're going to jail, both of you." "Tell Richard to hurry," I called out as Gary went sprinting down the sidewalk, his sandals slapping loudly against the concrete. "They work fast." I watched Gary run away until he rounded the corner. I took a deep breath, the smell of dust and goat heavy in the air. I looked at Chuck. Chuck looked at me. "Well," Chuck said, spitting another stream of tobacco juice into my flower bed. "That went about exactly as I expected." "Honestly," I said, dragging my lawn chair out of the garage and setting it up right on the driveway, front row center to the carnage. "I think that went even better than expected." I sat down. I cracked open a fresh bottle of water. The goats were making incredibly fast work of the front yard. A few of them had already discovered the patch of cheatgrass near the mailbox and were fighting over it like it was a 5-star meal. Bobby was walking the perimeter, making sure the hot wire was secure. It was, without a doubt, the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. I leaned back in my chair and pulled my phone out. I opened the Sovereign Ruling Channel dashboard. "Hey guys," I said, recording a quick video for the community tab. "Just a quick update. The HOA gave me 24 hours to mow my lawn, so I did what any reasonable sovereign citizen would do. I hired 40 independent contractors." I flipped the camera around to show the goats devouring my yard. "State law supersedes HOA bylaws, boys and girls. Remember that. The cops are probably on their way. Grab some popcorn." I hit post. I didn't have to wait long. About 20 minutes later, the goats had completely stripped the front lawn down to the dirt. It literally looked like someone had taken a massive razor blade and shaved the earth. They were currently working on a low-hanging branch of my decorative maple tree. Suddenly, a silver Mercedes SUV came tearing down the cul-de-sac, taking the corner way too fast. The tires squealed as it slammed on the brakes, parking crookedly right in front of my house. The door flew open. Richard had arrived. He wasn't wearing his reflective sunglasses anymore. His face was a deep, mottled crimson. He was practically vibrating with rage. He had his clipboard gripped so tightly in his hands I thought the plastic was going to snap. Gary was right behind him, jogging to keep up. Richard stormed up to the electric wire and stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the goats. He stared at the dirt where my grass used to be. He stared at the paper vest taped to the lead goat. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He was literally speechless. "Hey, Richard," I called out cheerfully from my lawn chair. "Just getting that lot into compliance for you. I think we're well under the 3-inch limit now. Do you want to use the ruler just to double-check?" Richard's head snapped toward me. The vein in his forehead looked like it was about to burst. "You—" Richard stammered, his voice shaking with a fury so pure it was almost religious. You have farm animals. You have farm animals eating the grass." "They're not farm animals, Richard," I corrected him, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my water. "Like I told Gary, these are state-sanctioned biological hazard abatement technicians. We're doing wildland-urban interface mitigation, just following the city fire code. Safety first, you know?" "I don't care about the city fire code!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking loudly. "I care about the bylaws. The bylaws explicitly forbid livestock." "Well, Richard, it's a good thing I care about the law," I said smoothly, "because Idaho Code 22247 says I have a duty to mitigate noxious weeds, and it says I can use goats to do it, and state law beats HOA bylaws, every single time. Richard looked at Chuck, who was leaning against his truck, looking completely bored. "Get these animals off this property immediately," Richard demanded, pointing at Chuck. "I am the president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association, and I am ordering you to cease and desist." Chuck slowly chewed his tobacco. He didn't even blink. "I don't work for you, buddy. I work for the guy signing the check. And right now, the check says these goats eat until the weeds are gone." One of the goats wandered over to the fence line, right in front of Richard. It looked up at him, let out a soft "maa," and then proceeded to eat a mouthful of Gary's prize-winning hostas that had poked through the property line. Gary shrieked again. Richard didn't yell this time. His face went completely cold. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. "I tried to be reasonable," Richard said, his voice dropping an octave. "I gave you a 24-hour notice. You chose to pull a stunt. A reckless, illegal, property value-destroying stunt." He started dialing. "I am calling the Boise Police Department. I am having you arrested for maintaining an illegal livestock operation, creating a public nuisance, and intentionally destroying property." He held the phone up to his ear. "Hello? Yes, police? I need dispatch to the Whispering Pines subdivision immediately. Yes, it's an emergency. A homeowner has brought a herd of livestock into the neighborhood. Yes, a herd. Dozens of them. Please send officers immediately." He hung up the phone. He looked at me with a triumphant, malicious smile. "They're on their way," Richard sneered. "I hope you enjoy explaining your little loophole to the judge." I didn't panic. I didn't flinch. I just smiled back. I reached into my back pocket, pulled out a thick, folded stack of papers, and set them gently on my lap. "Honestly, Richard," I said, leaning back in my chair and watching a goat attempt to eat the electric fence insulator, "I can't wait." The wait for the Boise Police Department took exactly 14 minutes, which honestly felt like a lifetime of pure, unadulterated comedy. I mean, you haven't truly lived until you've watched a grown man in khaki shorts try to maintain an aura of absolute authority while a goat actively tries to consume his shoelaces. Richard refused to leave the edge of my driveway. He just stood there, arms crossed, glaring at me like I had personally insulted his ancestors. Gary, on the other hand, was pacing back and forth on the sidewalk, muttering to himself and occasionally pointing a trembling finger at a particularly aggressive goat that was currently standing on its hind legs to strip the leaves off my decorative maple tree. The neighborhood, of course, had completely descended into chaos. Whispering Pines was normally the kind of place where the loudest noise was a luxury electric vehicle backing out of a garage. Now, it sounded like a petting zoo on steroids. I saw Mrs. Higgins from across the street tentatively step out onto her porch, clutching a small, yapping Pomeranian. The Johnson family next door actually brought out lawn chairs and set them up on their porch, cracking open sodas. They hated Richard just as much as I did, and I could tell they were absolutely living for this. I just sat in my chair, sipping my water, watching the goats work. It was honestly mesmerizing. They didn't just eat the grass, they annihilated it. They chewed through the stems, they ripped up the thatch, and when they found a patch of cheatgrass, they went absolutely feral. Chuck had moved the truck a bit to let Bobby start running the temporary electric wire along the side gate to give them access to the backyard, where the real forest of weeds was waiting. Then, the cavalry arrived. 2 Boise Police Department cruisers turned onto the cul-de-sac. They weren't running their sirens, but the flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pristine suburban houses, casting a wild disco glow over the herd of goats. The cruisers parked aggressively behind Richard's Mercedes, blocking the street. The doors opened, and 2 officers stepped out. One was a tall, broad-shouldered veteran cop, who looked like he was about 3 days away from retirement and had 0 patience left for the world. His name tag read, Miller. The other was a younger, thinner officer who looked like he was fresh out of the academy, looking around with wide, confused eyes. His tag read, Davis. They both unhooked their thumbs from their duty belts and walked slowly toward the driveway. They took one look at the electric wire, the 40 goats, Chuck spitting tobacco into the dirt, and Richard looking like he was about to have an aneurysm. Officer Miller stopped. He took off his sunglasses. He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "All right," Miller sighed, his voice sounding like gravel grinding in a blender. "Dispatch said there was a domestic disturbance involving unauthorized livestock and destruction of property. Who called it in?" "I did!" Richard practically screamed, waving his clipboard in the air as he marched toward the officers. "Richard Evans, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Officers, thank God you are here. This man," Richard pointed a shaking finger at me, "has completely lost his mind. He has brought a herd of filthy farm animals into a residential, restricted covenant community. They are destroying the landscaping, creating a massive public health hazard, and violating at least 6 different HOA bylaws." Officer Miller looked past Richard. He looked at the goats. He watched one goat, the one with my handmade state biotechnician vest, stand on its back legs and rip a massive chunk of bark off a tree. "Okay," Miller said slowly, turning his attention to me. "And you are the homeowner?" "Yes, sir," I said, standing up from my lawn chair. I walked over to the electric wire, holding my thick stack of printed papers. "Gay, sir. Nice to meet you." "Gay, sir," Miller repeated. "Care to explain why you are running a livestock operation in the middle of a subdivision? Because Mr. Evans here is right. This violates city zoning for agricultural animals. You can't just bring 40 goats into a residential neighborhood." "I totally agree, officer," I said, my voice completely calm and respectful. "If this were a livestock operation, it would be illegal, but it's not." "It's not," Officer Davis chimed in, stepping forward. He looked fascinated by the goats. "Then what is it? Because those are definitely goats, sir." "They are goats," I nodded. "But legally speaking, they are biological control agents. I am currently executing a state-mandated fire hazard mitigation protocol. I'm in compliance with the City of Boise Wildland Urban Interface Code." Richard let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Don't listen to him. He's spouting sovereign citizen nonsense. He's just trying to get out of a $500 fine for his grass being too tall." "Officer Miller," I said, ignoring Richard entirely. I handed the first document over the wire. "This is the official notice from the HOA, dated yesterday, acknowledging that my property has unkempt vegetation. They gave me 24 hours to remedy the situation." Miller took the orange paper. He glanced at it. "Okay, so why didn't you just mow it?" "My mower broke," I explained, gesturing to the closed garage door. "And every landscaper in Boise is booked solid. But honestly, even if I could mow it, a standard lawn mower wouldn't solve the underlying legal issue. My property backs up to the foothills. I have a massive infestation of Bromus tectorum in my backyard." "Bromus what?" Miller asked, narrowing his eyes. "Cheatgrass," Chuck rumbled, speaking up for the first time. He walked over, leaning on his sledgehammer. "Highly flammable, invasive, noxious weed. It's basically gasoline waiting for a match. Kid's yard is full of it." Miller looked at Chuck. "And who are you?" "Chuck. Chew on this grazing. I'm the contractor." Chuck reached into his back pocket and pulled out a laminated card, tossing it over the wire to the cop. "That's my state license for targeted agricultural grazing and noxious weed abatement." Miller looked at the license. Then he looked at me. "Okay, so you hired a goat guy. That still doesn't explain how you get around the zoning laws prohibiting farm animals." "That's the best part," I smiled, handing him the next document. It was a thick printout, highlighted in bright yellow. "This is Idaho State Code, Title 22, Chapter 24, Section 22-2407, the Noxious Weed Law. It explicitly states that it is the legal duty of every landowner to control noxious weeds on their land. And if you flip to page 3, you will see that the Idaho Department of Agriculture explicitly authorizes targeted grazing, using goats as a legally protected biological control method." Miller took the packet. He started reading. Officer Davis leaned over his shoulder, reading along. Furthermore, I continued, handing him the final document, this is the City of Boise Fire Code for the Wildland-Urban Interface. It requires homeowners to maintain defensible space and mitigate highly flammable brush. It specifically lists biological control as an approved method of hazard abatement. Richard was practically hyperventilating. This is ridiculous. It doesn't matter what that says. The Whispering Pines HOA bylaws explicitly state that no livestock can be kept on the property. Paragraph 8. Section A. The bylaws are binding. Officer Miller slowly lowered the state code printout. He looked at Richard. The look of exhaustion on the cop's face was so profound, it belonged in a museum. Mr. Evans, Miller said, his voice flat. Are you a lawyer? I am the president of the association. Richard puffed out his chest. I represent the legal interests of this community. Right, Miller sighed. Well, I'm not a lawyer either, but I've been a cop in this state for 22 years. And one thing I know for an absolute fact is that a private homeowner association bylaw does not supersede a state environmental mandate. The silence that fell over the driveway was deafening. The only sound was the rhythmic, relentless crunching of 40 goats eating my front lawn down to the root. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on a dock. You can't be serious. You're just going to let him do this? They are destroying the neighborhood. They're eating weeds, Richard, Officer Davis said, actually cracking a smile. Looks like they're doing a pretty good job, too. This is a civil matter, Officer Miller said, handing all the paperwork back to me. He clipped his pen back onto his uniform. Mr. Gazer here has provided valid documentation showing he is employing a licensed state contractor to fulfill a legal obligation under Idaho agricultural and fire codes. I cannot arrest a man for complying with state law. But the bylaws, Richard shrieked, actually stomping his foot on the concrete like a toddler. He is violating the contract he signed when he bought the house. You have to force him to remove the animals. Officer Miller took a step toward Richard. The cop's demeanor shifted from exhausted to intimidating in a fraction of a second. He towered over the HOA president. Mr. Evans, listen to me very carefully, Miller said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. I am telling you that this is a civil dispute over a contract. The police do not enforce HOA bylaws. If you want to sue him, hire a lawyer and take him to civil court. But right now, this man is conducting a state-sanctioned fire hazard mitigation project. Miller paused, letting the words sink in. In fact, Miller continued, his eyes narrowing, Idaho law takes the obstruction of environmental mitigation very seriously. If you attempt to force him to stop this abatement process, or if you attempt to harass his licensed state contractors, you could potentially be cited for interfering with a state agricultural mandate. Do you understand what I am saying to you? I thought Richard was going to pass out. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a very angry, sweaty ghost. He looked at the cops. He looked at Chuck, who was grinning around a mouthful of chewing tobacco. He looked at me, standing there holding my state statutes like a shield. This isn't over, Richard hissed, his voice trembling with a rage that shook his entire frame. He pointed a finger at me. You think you're so smart. You think you found a loophole. I am calling an emergency board meeting. We are going to fine you into bankruptcy. You'll be selling this house to pay off the liens we put on it. Good luck with that, Richard, I said, sitting back down in my lawn chair. Just make sure you mail the fines to the right address. I'd hate for them to get lost in the mail. Richard spun around and stormed back to his Mercedes. Gary, who had been completely silent for the last 10 minutes, scurried after him like a frightened rat. They jumped into the SUV, slammed the doors, and peeled out of the cul-de-sac, breaking the speed limit by at least 20 miles an hour. Officer Miller let out a long, heavy breath. He turned back to me. I gotta tell you, kid, Miller said, shaking his head. I get a lot of stupid calls. A lot of neighbor disputes over fences being 2 inches over the property line or dogs barking too loud. But renting a herd of goats to nuke an HOA lawn ordinance? That is the most brilliantly petty thing I have ever seen. Honestly, officer, I laughed. I didn't want to do it. They gave me 24 hours. I was just trying to be compliant. Malicious compliance? Officer Davis chuckled. I love it. Can I take a picture? My brother lives in an HOA and he is going to lose his mind when he sees this. Go for it, I said, gesturing to the herd. Make sure you get the one in the vest. He's the shift supervisor. The cops spent another 5 minutes taking photos of the goats, chatting with Chuck about hunting up in the panhandle, and generally just enjoying the sheer absurdity of the situation. By the time they finally got back in their cruisers and drove away, the front yard was completely decimated. There was no grass, there were no weeds. There were just a few stubborn roots and a whole lot of freshly tilled, goat-fertilized dirt. Chuck whistled sharply, a piercing sound that echoed off the houses. All right, front yard is tapped out. Bobby, drop the side wire. Bobby unclipped the poly wire blocking the side gate. The goats didn't even need to be herded. They smelled the massive, untouched buffet of cheat grass and dandelions waiting in the backyard. The herd surged forward, a tidal wave of horns and hooves, funneling through the narrow wooden gate and disappearing behind my house. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting on my back patio, drinking iced tea and watching the destruction. It was incredible how efficient they were. They worked methodically, clearing out the tall, dry stalks of cheatgrass first, then moving on to the broadleaf weeds, and finally stripping the overgrown lilac bushes along the back fence, up to a perfectly uniform height of about 5 feet, exactly as high as the goats could reach when they stood on their hind legs. By 4:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Richard's deadline, my property was completely, utterly barren. It looked like a controlled burn had come through and selectively deleted every piece of vegetation. Chuck backed the trailer up to the side gate. He and Bobby herded the goats back inside, tossing a few flakes of alfalfa into the trailer as a reward. The goats hopped in, looking fat, happy, and exhausted. Well, kid, Chuck said, slapping the back door of the trailer shut and locking the heavy deadbolt. I'd say you are officially mitigated. You ain't got enough fuel left in this yard to start a campfire, let alone a wildfire. Chuck, you are a lifesaver, I said, handing him an envelope with $800 in cash. Seriously, you have no idea how much joy this has brought me. Chuck pocketed the envelope and pulled a small white block wrapped in wax paper out of the cooler in the bed of his truck. He tossed it to me. I caught it. It was heavy and cold. Complimentary goat cheese, Chuck grinned. Made it myself. Goes great on a cracker. You take care of yourself, Gazer, and if that HOA gives you any more grief, you just give me a call. I got a herd of sheep that are even meaner than these guys. I watched Chuck's massive, dusty Ford rumble out of the neighborhood, taking the scent of livestock and rebellion with it. I stood alone in my backyard. It was quiet again. The sun was starting to set, casting long, golden shadows across the expanse of pure dirt that used to be my lawn. I pulled out my phone and took a panoramic photo of the devastation. I made sure to get the timestamp in the corner of the photo. 4:58 p.m. 2 minutes to spare. I was fully, legally compliant with the 24-hour notice. The vegetation had been remedied. I slept like a baby that night. The next morning, the fallout began. I walked out to get my mail, and taped to the front of my mailbox was a thick manila envelope. It was sealed with heavy packing tape, looking more like a bomb threat than a piece of neighborhood correspondence. I took it inside, grabbed a cup of coffee, and sliced it open with a kitchen knife. Inside was a formal legal summons on heavy watermarked paper. Notice of emergency tribunal and disciplinary hearing. Homeowner Gazer is hereby summoned to an emergency closed session meeting of the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors to be held at the community clubhouse at 7:15 p.m. this evening. The purpose of this hearing is to address multiple severe, egregious, and intentional violations of the community bylaws, including but not limited to 1. Unauthorized maintenance of agricultural livestock, Section 8, Para A. 2. Erection of unapproved electrified fencing, Section 5, Para C. 3. intentional destruction of approved landscaping, Section 4, Para B. 4. Creating a public nuisance and health hazard, Section 12, Para A. 5. Harassment and insubordination toward a board member. Failure to appear will result in an immediate default judgment against the homeowner. The board intends to levy maximum punitive fines for each individual violation, totaling no less than $5,000, and will place an immediate lien on the property until the fines are paid in full. $5,000. They weren't just trying to punish me. They were trying to make an example out of me. Richard wanted to crush me so hard that nobody in the neighborhood would ever dare to leave their trash cans out 5 minutes past the deadline ever again. I set the paper down on the kitchen counter. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel panicked. I felt a deep, profound sense of focus. This was exactly what I had prepared for. This was the climax. I spent the rest of the day getting my arsenal ready. I didn't just print out the state statutes this time. I went to the local office supply store and had them professionally bound in glossy black presentation folders. I printed out the Idaho Department of Agriculture's white paper on targeted grazing. I printed out the city of Boise's WUI compliance checklist. I printed out 3 different state Supreme Court rulings regarding the supremacy of state environmental law over private restrictive covenants. I made 5 copies of everything, one for each member of the HOA board. At 6:45 p.m., I put on a crisp white button-down shirt and a pair of dark slacks. I wanted to look professional. I wanted to look like a man who was about to dismantle an institution. I grabbed my leather briefcase, loaded it with the presentation folders, and walked out the door. The Whispering Pines Community Clubhouse was a pretentious little building at the center of the subdivision, complete with fake Greek columns and a permanently locked swimming pool. When I walked through the double-glass doors, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. The main meeting room was set up like a courtroom. A long mahogany table was positioned at the front of the room. Sitting behind it were the 5 members of the HOA board. Richard was in the center seat, looking like a petty dictator who had finally been given the launch codes. Gary sat to his right, nervously chewing on a pen. The other 3 board members, a retired accountant named Helen, a real estate agent named Mark, and a guy named Steve, who never spoke, looked incredibly uncomfortable. There was a single metal folding chair placed in the middle of the room, facing the board. "Take a seat," Richard commanded, his voice echoing in the empty room. He didn't even look up from his clipboard. I didn't sit in the folding chair. I walked right past it and approached the mahogany table. "I'd prefer to stand, Richard." "This won't take long," I said, placing my leather briefcase on the edge of the table. I popped the brass latches. Click, click. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "This is a formal disciplinary hearing, not a negotiation," Richard said sharply, finally looking up. His eyes were cold and vindictive. "You are here to answer for the complete and utter destruction of your property and the blatant disregard for the rules that keep this community civilized. We have drafted the fines. $5,000. Payable immediately, or the lien goes on the house tomorrow morning." "Before we get to the fines, Richard," I said, my voice smooth and practiced, "I'd like to present some documentation to the board." I pulled the 5 glossy black presentation folders out of my briefcase. I slid one across the table to Helen. I slid one to Mark. I slid one to Steve. I slid one to Gary. I held the last one in my hand and looked directly at Richard. I didn't give it to him. I just placed it on the table in front of me. "What is this?" Helen asked, opening the folder and adjusting her reading glasses. "Idaho State Code?" "Exactly, Helen," I said, projecting my voice so it carried clearly. "What you are looking at is a comprehensive legal defense proving that every single action I took yesterday was not only perfectly legal, but was actually a state-mandated obligation." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "I told the police, and I will tell you, state agricultural codes do not override our bylaws. You signed a contract." "Actually, Richard, they do." Mark, the real estate agent, spoke up quietly. He was flipping through the Supreme Court precedent summaries I had included. "In property law, If a restrictive covenant prevents a homeowner from complying with a municipal or state safety ordinance, the covenant is legally unenforceable. It's called the doctrine of public policy. Richard shot Mark a look of pure venom. "Shut up, Mark. You don't know what you're talking about." "I literally sell houses for a living, Richard," Mark shot back, his face flushing. "I know how zoning and covenants work. And looking at this, he's right. He's in a wildland-urban interface zone." "Thank you, Mark," I said. I opened my own folder. "Let's go through the charges, shall we?" Charge 1. Unauthorized livestock. As documented in Tab 3, the animals present on my property were not livestock. They were contracted biological control agents, licensed by the state, deployed specifically for fire hazard mitigation. Therefore, the livestock ban does not apply. I looked around the table. Helen was nodding slowly. Gary was sweating profusely. Charge 2. Unapproved fencing, I continued. Under OSHA and state agricultural safety guidelines, any deployment of biological control agents requires a temporary electrified containment perimeter to protect the public. Denying me the fence would be denying me the ability to safely mitigate the fire hazard, which is a violation of state law. "You destroyed the landscaping," Richard yelled, his composure completely fracturing. "You turned your front yard into a dirt pit. That is an aesthetic violation." Charge 3, I smiled, turning to the next page. Destruction of landscaping. The HOA gave me a 24-hour notice to remedy overgrown vegetation. Given the presence of highly flammable Bromus tectorum, cheatgrass, the most effective and legally recognized remedy was complete biological eradication. I complied with your notice, Richard. I removed the vegetation. All of it. Within the 24-hour window. "It's dirt!" Richard shrieked, standing up from his chair. "It's just dirt!" "It's a mitigated fire break," I corrected him calmly. Which brings me to the most important part of this presentation. If you turn to the final tab in your folders, you will see a printed copy of the Idaho State Environmental Obstruction Statutes. The room went dead silent. Helen flipped to the back of the folder. Her eyes widened. "Under Idaho law," I said, my voice dropping to a serious, commanding tone, "any individual or corporate entity, which includes an HOA board, that intentionally interferes with, obstructs, or attempts to penalize a homeowner for complying with state fire hazard mitigation protocols is subject to severe legal consequences." I leaned over the table, planting my hands on the mahogany, looking directly into Richard's eyes. "If you issue me a $5,000 fine today, Richard, you are officially creating a paper trail proving that the Whispering Pines HOA is penalizing me for obeying state fire codes. I won't just refuse to pay it. I will immediately file an injunction in state civil court. I will report this board to the state fire marshal for obstruction. And I will personally sue you, Richard, along with every single board member sitting at this table, for harassment and tortious interference." I let the threat hang in the air. "I have the state statutes on my side. I have the police report from yesterday proving you tried to illegally stop the mitigation. And I have 40 very satisfied goats who can testify to the quality of the cheatgrass." I stood up straight, buttoning my suit jacket. "So, the way I see it, you have 2 choices. You can drop these ridiculous charges, void the original $500 grass fine, and we can all go home and pretend this never happened. Or you can issue the fine, and I will see every single one of you in court on Monday morning, where I will ensure that the legal fees alone bankrupt this association." I looked at Helen. "Your choice, Helen." I looked at Mark. "Your choice, Mark." Then I looked at Richard. The HOA president was shaking. His face was pale. The absolute, unshakable power he thought he wielded with his clipboard and his bylaws had just been completely shattered by a guy who rented a petting zoo. "I motion to dismiss the charges," Mark said instantly, closing the black folder and sliding it away from him. "I second the motion," Helen said, her voice slightly breathless. This is way above our heads. We cannot risk a state lawsuit over a lawn." "Steve?" Mark asked. Steve, the guy who never spoke, just nodded aggressively. "That's 3 votes," Mark said, looking at Richard. "The motion passes. The charges are dropped. The original fine is voided." Richard didn't say a word. He just stared at me, his eyes wide and hollow. He looked down at the table, picked up his pen, and slowly, deliberately, scratched a massive X across the Notice of Emergency Hearing document. He didn't look back up. I reached out, closed my briefcase, and grabbed the handle. "Pleasure doing business with you, board," I said cheerfully. I turned around and walked down the center aisle of the clubhouse. I pushed the double-glass doors open, stepping out into the warm Idaho summer night. I took a deep breath of the air. It smelled like dust, victory, and just a faint, lingering hint of goat. They wanted the grass gone in 24 hours. I gave them exactly what they asked for. Remember, folks, they might have the bylaws, but you have the law. Stay sovereign, stay compliant, and never be afraid to rent a herd of goats.